The night was supposed to be quiet. A calm, ordinary night in a small Nigerian village where families had settled under dusty roofs and children fell asleep to the sound of crickets. But somewhere past midnight a phone rang. It was a trembling call that woke Reverend Ezekiel from his bed. "Don't come," they warned him. "The road is dangerous. Something terrible has happened." He didn't listen. By sunrise, Ezekiel was already on the move, walking into a silence so heavy that even the birds refused to sing. The young men of the village met him at the entrance, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. "You told us not to fight back," they said. "Please, come and see." They led him into the first hut. His grandmother lay still on the dirt floor, the broken half of a knife still lodged in her chest. In the next hut, the bodies of his uncle's wife and 5 children were lined up on the ground, their final moments frozen in a horror too great for words. This was not war. This was not conflict. This was the deliberate erasing of families. And it was only one village. Across northern Nigeria, entire communities have lived through nights like this, where homes are burned, little girls disappear, and the world outside remains painfully silent. In some places, a single burial mound holds more than 100 people. In others, parents wake to find their children gone forever, taken by militants who operate with impunity. And yet, despite decades of documentation, thousands of names, and countless eyewitness accounts, the world still treats these tragedies as footnotes. Why? How many more villages must vanish before the world finally calls this what it is, a genocide? For those of you watching, especially those who care deeply about Africa's future, this story matters. It is part of a larger pattern. The world must confront the same pattern, shaping today's Africa news from Nigeria to Burkina Faso, where leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré are fighting their own battles for security and sovereignty. If you believe these stories should no longer be hidden, stay with us. The morning light had only just begun to break over the village when Reverend Ezekiel stepped into the first hut. The air inside was cold, unnaturally still, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. His grandmother lay where she had fallen, her body slumped forward as though she had tried to rise one last time. The blade driven into her chest had snapped in half, not from time or rust, but from the force of the attack. It was the kind of scene that strips a person of words, leaving only the raw instinct to weep. But the young men at his side insisted he keep going. They led him to the next hut, their footsteps heavy in the dust. Inside, the remains of his uncle's family lay together, a mother and 5 small children. Some looked as if they had been trying to shield one another. Others showed signs of a struggle that lasted longer than their strength. To Ezekiel, it felt as though the entire world had folded in on itself. This was not merely a loss. This was the destruction of a lineage, a story erased in one night. And yet this was only one family in one village. The same morning, dozens of other communities across northern Nigeria awoke to devastation that mirrored this one: burned houses, missing relatives, lifeless bodies curled on the ground. These attacks were not spontaneous flare-ups of anger. They were coordinated. That was the most chilling part. Everywhere the Reverend went, the villagers repeated the same phrase: "They came at night." They knew exactly where to go. For 25 years, a man named Mark, a former building engineer turned human rights advocate, has been documenting each attack with painstaking care, village by village, name by name, year after year. He carries handwritten lists, some hundreds of names long, with ages, locations, and causes of death. He has witnessed more than most men could bear. He stood beside Reverend Ezekiel that morning, nodding quietly as each detail was confirmed. Every village he enters adds another page to his record, another chapter in a tragedy the world refuses to acknowledge. In just a single 10-day window from November 9th to November 19th, the data he collected was staggering: 48 people killed, 186 abducted. Many of those abducted were young girls. Some were later sold. Others were forced into marriages or turned into sex slaves. Many have never been found. Every number has a face. Every face has a family, and every family now carries a wound that may never heal. The attacks spanned multiple regions: Plateau State, Benue, Kaduna, each with its own list of the dead. In Bassa, farmers were gunned down on their way to the fields. In Benue, travelers ambushed along the road. In Kaduna, a Catholic priest, Father Pascal, was abducted and later murdered despite pleas from his parish community. His death reverberated far beyond his church walls. Yeah, it was another message from the attackers: no one, not even clergy, is safe. And then there were the mass graves. Reverend Ezekiel spoke of days when he had buried 100 people at once, sometimes more. Long trenches dug into the earth, bodies placed side by side, names recorded hurriedly as the air filled with the smell of dust and grief. Mark had the list's pages filled with hundreds of names from a single location. Some were entire households, others were children whose names were written down by neighbors because no relatives had survived. This wasn't a new phenomenon. It wasn't even recent. Books documenting these killings date back to 2008, then again in 2014, each warning of a growing crisis, a crisis global powers and Africa news outlets consistently overlooked. While militants organized, armed themselves, and expanded their territory, survivors were left to gather their dead in silence. By the time Reverend Ezekiel finished recounting his story, it was clear this was no longer about isolated incidents or sporadic violence. This was a systematic effort to erase Christian communities from large parts of Nigeria, and the world, distracted by politics and distance, had scarcely blinked. By the time the testimonies of that week were gathered, the situation had risen to a level of horror that no community, no matter how strong, could silently endure. The absolute climax of the tragedy emerged not from a single death, but from the scale that even the most seasoned human rights workers struggled to comprehend. Reverend Ezekiel spoke with a voice that seemed to tremble under the memory. There were days when he buried more than 100 people at once. A single trench stretched across the earth, wide enough to hold generations. Mothers, fathers, children, entire households lowered together into the soil. Men who had not cried in decades found themselves kneeling at the edge of the mass grave, fists pressed against their faces, overwhelmed by a grief too large for their bodies. Mark the documentarian quietly placed a long sheet of paper on the table, a list of 500 names from just one region, each name representing a life erased in a coordinated attack. Some names were familiar to him. He had visited their homes before. Others represented children so young that the villagers had to guess their exact ages. Even for a man who had recorded deaths for 25 years, this list was different. It was not a record, it was a wound. And this was the moment when the community realized the violence was not random. It was strategic, organized, financed. The militants described in the transcript as fanatical terrorist groups were not simply roaming freely. They were preparing for something far larger. Women in extremist cells were said to be contributing 100,000 naira each. Men contributed 200,000 naira. All of it, the villagers claimed, went toward weapons transportation and the planning of a jihad season aimed at striking communities during Christmas when families gather and churches are full. This revelation sent a shockwave through the villages. People had known fear before, but this was different. This was anticipation, the kind that makes mothers sleep with their children in their arms, the kind that makes every dog bark feel like a threat. In the far north, rumors spread of increasing recruitment, more weapons flowing across porous borders, more meetings held under the cover of night. But perhaps the deepest emotional climax came from the religious response, an outpouring of grief, anger, and desperate hope. Churches that once echoed with hymns now echoed with sobbing. Some believers clung to their Bibles, others clenched their fists, torn between faith and fury. And in the center of it all, Reverend Ezekiel stood before his congregation and spoke words that cut through the thick pain. Your prayer is more than an AK-47, more than a rocket launcher. People lifted their hands shaking. Some whispered prayers, others shouted them as if trying to reach heaven with sheer force. It wasn't theology, it was survival. It was the only weapon they had left. Meanwhile, in the international sphere, the reaction was painfully muted. While the United States had officially designated Nigeria as a country of particular concern, nothing on the ground reflected meaningful intervention. No peacekeeping force, no coordinated pressure, no global outrage. It felt to the survivors as though the world had quietly decided that their suffering belonged to a distant continent and therefore required no immediate response. Mark called it a loud silence. A silence that had lasted for 2 decades. A silence that allowed the bloodshed to spread from village to village year after year. A silence that only became louder as communities begged for help. Inside Nigeria, the reaction from Christians was unity forged under fire. Some traveled for days to comfort neighboring survivors. Others risked their lives to bury the dead with dignity. Some pastors joined forces creating networks to warn each other of impending attacks, while volunteers moved between states to rescue families trapped by advancing militants. And yet, even in these darkest moments, one sentiment remained unshaken. The devil has failed. The people believed fiercely that their land still belonged to God, that Nigeria was the trigger point of revival on the African continent, and that the violence was an attack not just on lives, but on destiny. But faith did not erase the fear, nor did it stop the militants. And as this section draws to a close, one truth becomes unavoidable: the violence had reached its peak, but the world had not yet awakened. When a village is attacked in the night, the damage does not end when the shooting stops. Long after the smoke clears, long after the last body is buried, the real consequences begin to unfold, slow, heavy, and deeply human. In northern Nigeria, the aftermath of these massacres has reshaped entire communities, leaving scars not only on the land, but on the very fabric of society. The first and most immediate consequence is the collapse of daily life. Farmers no longer rise before dawn to tend their fields. The paths they once walked are now roads of death, places where neighbors have been ambushed and murdered. Women who used to fetch water at sunrise now travel in frightened groups, constantly glancing over their shoulders. Children, once the heartbeat of every African village, no longer play freely in the open. Some stay indoors for weeks, too traumatized to step outside. Others have become orphans overnight. Schools have also suffered. In many communities, classrooms stand abandoned, their chalkboards still bearing half-written lessons from the day before the attack. Teachers flee. Parents refuse to risk the lives of their children. And in places where schools reopen, attendance is sparse, not because children don't want to learn, but because fear waits on every road. The second consequence is the political fracture that deepens with every incident. In village meetings, in church gatherings, in hushed conversations around cooking fires, a painful question echoes. Where was the government? People feel abandoned, betrayed by leaders who promised security but delivered none. Some local officials are suspected of silently cooperating with militants, whether through corruption, intimidation, or shared interests. When a system fails repeatedly, suspicion becomes the default, and trust becomes a luxury. This breakdown of trust leaves a dangerous vacuum. In many communities, traditional structures, elders, pastors, local chiefs have taken on the role the government failed to fulfill. They warn villagers of impending attacks, organize night watches, decide when families should flee or stay. But while these leaders carry courage on their shoulders, they do not carry weapons. Their authority is moral, not military. And militants do not respect morality. The third consequence is religious devastation. Houses of worship that once anchored communities are now symbols of vulnerability. Priests and pastors have been abducted, tortured, and murdered. Father Pascal's killing sent shockwaves far beyond his parish. When clergy are targeted, the message is chillingly clear: no one is safe. Churches that once echoed with hymns now echo with whispered prayers. Families huddled together asking for divine protection. Religious gatherings now carry fear alongside faith. And then there is the psychological toll, a heavy, invisible darkness. Survivors speak of nights where they cannot sleep. Mothers dream of children who are gone. Men who once stood proudly as protectors now feel powerless in the face of organized terror. Trauma weaves itself into every conversation, every breath, every memory of what used to be home. Economically, the region is suffocating. Farms are abandoned, markets shrink, transport routes become death corridors. With every attack, poverty tightens its grip, pushing families deeper into desperation. Finally, the long-term civil consequence is mass displacement. Entire communities flee across state lines, some into Cameroon, some into makeshift camps in Jos. Mark's documentation includes the stories of over 10,000 families displaced for 4 years, families who lived in tents waiting for a day when it might be safe to return. Some were eventually resettled in America. Others still wander between temporary shelters, carrying nothing but memories and grief. Politically, Nigeria finds itself at a crossroads. The violence is no longer a series of isolated tragedies. It is a test of the nation's ability to protect its citizens, uphold justice, and confront the forces pulling it apart. And the world watching from afar must decide whether this crisis remains a local tragedy or becomes a turning point for international action. From a distance, Nigeria's suffering can seem like another tragedy in a long list of global crises, a headline that flashes briefly before disappearing beneath newer stories. But for Americans who have followed Africa for decades, the question is far more personal. How can such widespread violence continue for so long with so little global intervention? And what does it reveal about the world's priorities? The United States has acknowledged Nigeria's crisis in official documents by designating it a country of particular concern, a label reserved for nations facing severe violations of religious freedom. But for the families living through these attacks, the designation brought little relief. No peacekeeping missions followed. No emergency humanitarian corridor was established. No large-scale diplomatic pressure was mobilized. For many American viewers, especially older generations who remember the era of strong U.S. engagement in global human rights, this response feels painfully insufficient. In conversations across the American faith community, the same thought surfaces again and again. If these massacres had taken place in Europe, would the world have reacted differently? It is a question that lingers in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Meanwhile, American churches and humanitarian groups have quietly carried much of the burden. Some have helped evacuate persecuted Christians, creating pathways for families to rebuild their lives in the United States. The transcript mentions families who were airlifted to America, living proof that compassion can cross oceans even when governments fail to act decisively. Yet these isolated efforts are not enough to address a crisis of this magnitude. Globally, the silence is even more deafening. International organizations issue statements of concern, but little changes on the ground. African regional bodies struggle to coordinate responses across borders, weakened by insurgency, corruption, and competing political interests. Nations that might help are often preoccupied with their own instability or economic challenges. And yet outside of Nigeria, a quiet shift is happening, a shift that could reshape how the world confronts insecurity across the African continent. Countries like Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali have begun pushing for new forms of regional security, new alliances, and new leadership models. Many Americans over 60 who follow Africa news closely have begun asking whether the continent's emerging leaders, including those like President Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, are responding more decisively to extremism than traditional governments have. This growing curiosity is not a coincidence. As Nigeria's crisis deepens, people are beginning to compare different national responses across West Africa. Some nations are taking bold, controversial steps to protect their citizens. Others are following older frameworks that no longer match the threats of today. For the U.S., this raises urgent questions. How should America engage with African nations rebuilding their security models from the ground up? Should the U.S. continue offering symbolic designations? Or is it time for direct cooperation against extremist networks? And how long can the international community ignore what many experts now classify as a slow-moving genocide? The world's inaction sends a message louder than any speech. Suffering that happens far away can be tolerated. But history has shown that crises ignored do not vanish. They spread cross borders, destabilize regions, and reshape global politics. Nigeria's tragedy is not just a Nigerian issue. It sits at the crossroads of religious freedom, global security, and the moral responsibility of nations that claim to defend human rights. For Americans watching closely, this is not simply a story of Africa, it is a story of what the world chooses to protect and what it allows to be lost. When a nation bleeds for so many years, when mothers bury children whose names the world will never know, and when entire communities vanish into the silence of unmarked graves, a moment finally arrives when the truth can no longer be ignored. Nigeria has reached that moment. What began as scattered attacks has grown into a pattern of violence so clear, so well documented, and so relentless that calling it anything less than genocide would be a failure of honesty. But the greatest danger now is not only the violence itself, it is the world's ability to grow numb to it. When tragedies repeat long enough, they risk becoming background noise. When headlines fade, compassion fades with them. And when compassion fades, suffering multiplies. That is the warning this story carries. If the global community, including nations like the United States, long seen as defenders of human rights, continues to treat Nigeria's crisis as a distant problem, the consequences will not remain trapped within one region. Instability spreads like fire. It crosses borders, weakens states, and emboldens extremist groups who watch carefully to see where the world does nothing. Across West Africa today, you can feel the ground shifting. Nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are rewriting their security strategies. Leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré are emerging as symbols of a new political reality, one that refuses to wait for outside rescue. Whether people agree with their methods or not, the message is clear. Africa is tired of burying its own children while the world debates terminology. And this is where the story broadens. Because this is not only a Nigerian tragedy, tragedy. It is a mirror reflecting the vulnerability of millions across the Sahel. A mirror showing how fragile peace can be when communities stand alone. A mirror reminding us that behind every statistic is a grandmother, a pastor, a child asleep when the door splintered open. For viewers in America, especially those who have followed Africa news for decades, the question is no longer rhetorical. It becomes personal. What kind of world do we become if we allow an entire people to suffer in silence? And at what point does silence turn into complicity? You watching this may not be able to stop a militant group. You may not control the borders of a distant country, but your voice, your awareness, your willingness to acknowledge the truth, these things matter. It is awareness that has always pushed history forward. It is ordinary people refusing to look away who have sparked the greatest changes. So let me end with this. If you believe stories like these should no longer be hidden, if you believe African families deserve the same dignity and security as families anywhere else, if you believe leaders from Nigeria to Burkina Faso must be held to a higher standard of protecting their people, then please share this message. You might be one of the first to push it beyond the silence. And if you believe that truth should always rise above headlines, subscribe so more people can see what the world has tried to forget.